It didn't begin with a gunshot. It began with a letter. In the summer of 1969, the newsrooms of the San Francisco Bay Area's largest papers received a chilling message. It opened with 3 words that would terrorize a generation. "This is the Zodiac speaking. In the dark history of American crime, there have been many killers. But there has never been anyone quite like the Zodiac. He didn't just murder," he taunted. "He didn't hide in the shadows. He performed on the front page of every newspaper. He was, arguably, America's first serial killer to turn his crimes into a media spectacle, a terrifying game played with the public as his audience." So what creates a monster like this? Why would a killer crave public validation more than anything else? And how, after more than 50 years, thousands of suspects and countless man-hours, has America's most infamous phantom never been unmasked? Today, we are not just investigating the crimes. We are attempting to dissect the mind of the Zodiac.
To understand the crime, we must first understand the mind. But with the Zodiac, there is no childhood trauma to analyze, no school records to sift through, no family to interview. The Zodiac is a ghost, defined not by a past, but by the elaborate persona he built for himself. His formative years are not a story of a person, but a story of a performance. And that performance began on the perfect stage, the San Francisco Bay Area in the late 1960s. This wasn't just a place, it was a societal fissure. The summer of love had just ended, leaving a dark hangover. It was an era of intense social chaos, student protests, and a widening generation gap. Trust in authority was collapsing, and the media was becoming more powerful than ever. Into this void of confusion stepped a new kind of monster, one who understood this chaos perfectly and knew exactly how to exploit it. The Zodiac's letters are his autobiography. They are the only formative years we have access to, and they paint a chilling portrait. His tone is a toxic cocktail of arrogance and insecurity. He boasts constantly, "I am not sick. I am more clever than the police," he wrote. He relished in his perceived intellectual superiority, yet this genius consistently misspelled simple words like Christmas or citizens. Experts are divided. Were these genuine errors or calculated taunts designed to make the police underestimate him? Either way, they served his purpose. His true motive was spelled out in his first-ever cipher. He wasn't killing for pleasure in the traditional sense. He was collecting slaves for the afterlife. This grandiose, almost mythological fantasy speaks volumes. It reveals a man with a profound sense of grandiosity, someone who saw himself not as a simple criminal, but as a godlike figure, a puppet master designing his own eternal kingdom. And then there were the ciphers. This was his masterstroke. This wasn't just murder, it was an intellectual challenge, a game. The first, the Z408 cipher, was sent in 3 parts to 3 different newspapers, a brilliant move that forced them to cooperate and maximize his media footprint. He demanded they be printed on the front page, or he would kill again. But the ultimate humiliation for law enforcement came when this complex cipher wasn't cracked by the FBI or the NSA. It was solved in less than a week by a high school teacher and his wife, Donald and Betty Hardin. This outcome was likely a fantasy come true for the killer, proving he could outsmart the professionals and be understood only by ordinary intelligent citizens. He immediately followed up with more. The Z340 cipher, a far more complex creation, would remain unsolved for an astonishing 51 years, a testament to the enduring, obsessive shadow he cast. It wasn't cracked until 2020 by a team of civilian code breakers. From this evidence, the letters, the motives, the codes, a profile emerges. We are looking for a man who is pathologically narcissistic, someone with a desperate, all-consuming need for attention. He is intelligent, or at least deeply invested in appearing intelligent. He is organized, meticulous, and sees his brutal murders not as an end, but as a means to his true goal, Fame.
For years, these grandiose fantasies of ciphers, slaves, and eternal infamy likely remained just that, a dark, private obsession brewing in a restless and arrogant mind. But for a pathological narcissist, a private fantasy is ultimately unfulfilling. A performance requires an audience. A god requires worshippers. A game requires players. The internal pressure to validate his own genius, to force the world to acknowledge his existence and his perceived superiority, must have become an unbearable driving force. This wasn't a sudden, chaotic snap of uncontrollable rage, the kind born from passion or immediate conflict. This was a cold, calculated decision to escalate. It was the moment an author decides to finally publish his manuscript. This trigger wasn't a who or a what, it was a when. It was the moment his meticulous planning was complete. He had likely spent months, perhaps years, scouting locations, studying police patrols, and perfecting his methods. He wasn't just preparing for a murder, he was preparing for a debut. He needed to create his origin story, and for that he needed the perfect stage. He found it on a lonely, dark stretch of Lake Herman Road in Benicia, California. It was a well-known local lover's lane, a place where teenage couples went for privacy. For the Zodiac, it offered something else: isolation, predictability, and vulnerable targets. It was the perfect, controlled environment for a first performance, a chilling rehearsal for the public chaos he planned to unleash. On the frigid winter night of December 20th, 1968, just 5 days before Christmas, that internal trigger finally fired. His chosen players were 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen. It was their first formal date. They were parked in a gravel turnout, two innocent high school students who had no idea they were about to become the first footnotes in one of America's darkest legends. The attack was methodical, not chaotic. Another car pulled into the turnout and parked beside them. The killer, under the cover of darkness, likely ordered them out of the vehicle. David Faraday was shot first, a single, precise shot to the head as he stepped out of the car. Betty Lou Jensen tried to run. She was shot 5 times in the back, a brutal and systematic execution. The killer then got back in his car and drove away, vanishing into the night. When police arrived, the scene was baffling. The car doors were open, the radio still playing. There was no evidence of robbery. Darlene's purse and David's wallet were untouched. There was no apparent sexual motive. It was just cold, calculated, and utterly senseless violence. The local police were stumped. They had no suspects, no motive, and no leads. The case was a brutal, random, and terrifying mystery. For 7 agonizing months, that's all it was. A tragic, unsolved local murder. The killer remained silent. This silence was itself a crucial part of the plan. He was letting the fear settle. He was waiting, allowing the first act to stand on its own before he, the author, stepped out from behind the curtain. The Zodiac wasn't born on Lake Herman Road. He was only conceived there. The true trigger wasn't the physical act of murder itself. It was the knowledge that he had done it, that he had gotten away with it, and that he now held the credentials to begin his real game. The performance had begun, and he was the only one who knew the script. He now had the power to announce himself to the world. And he was just waiting for the perfect moment to do it. For 7 months, the Lake Herman Road murders remained a cold, silent mystery. Then, on the 4th of July 1969, the performance escalated. The stage was another lover's lane, this time at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. The victims were 22-year-old Darlene Ferrin and 19-year-old Michael Mageau sitting in a parked car. Just after midnight, another car pulled up, parking behind them, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It drove away, only to return 10 minutes later, blocking their escape. The driver exited, a heavy flashlight in hand, and approached the passenger side. Darlene and Michael assumed it was a police officer. The figure aimed the light directly into their eyes, blinding them. Then, without a single word, he raised a 9mm pistol and opened fire, unleashing a barrage of bullets into the car. The attack was swift, brutal, and precise. The killer then walked calmly back to his car and drove away. But this time the act wasn't complete. 40 minutes later, the Vallejo Police Department received a phone call. The voice was male, monotone, and chillingly calm. He spoke in a rehearsed, almost robotic cadence. "I wish to report a double murder. If you will go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye. This was the moment. The killer had given himself a voice. He had linked his crimes. He had established his pattern. Michael Majot, despite being shot 4 times, would survive. Darlene Ferrin would not. The Phantom now had a living witness, and he had a direct line to the police. Less than 3 months later, on September 27, 1969, the Zodiac shifted his script entirely, moving from the darkness of Lovers' Lanes to the bright sunshine of Lake Berryessa. This would be his most bizarre and theatrical performance. College students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were picnicking on a remote peninsula. They saw a man approaching from the woods. He was wearing a strange medieval-style black executioner's hood, dark glasses, and a bib-like garment emblazoned with a white circle and crosshairs, the symbol he would soon make infamous. He was carrying a gun, but also had a knife sheathed at his hip. He told the couple he was an escaped convict from a Montana prison, that he needed their car and money to get to Mexico. He spoke calmly, almost politely. He was in complete control. After binding them with plastic clothesline, he suddenly stated, "I'm going to have to stab you people." He then methodically, and without any sign of rage, stabbed Brian 6 times and Cecilia 10 times, but the act wasn't over. This was not a crime of passion. It was a procedural act of branding. The killer then walked calmly to Brian Hartnell's car. Using a black marker, he drew his crosshairs symbol on the door. Beneath it, he logged his work, creating a chilling ledger. Vallejo, 328, 7469, 72769, 63, by knife. He had just signed his masterpiece. He then drove 27 miles to downtown Napa, found a payphone, and just as before made a call. He reported the double murder and described the location, ending his call by calmly stating, "I'm the one that did it." Cecilia Shepard would die 2 days later. Brian Hartnell would survive to tell the tale. Just 2 weeks after that, on October 11, 1969, he changed the rules again, taking his game from isolated rural areas to the heart of the city itself. He hailed a cab driven by 29-year-old Paul Stine in San Francisco's theater district. He asked to be taken to the affluent neighborhood of Presidio Heights. At the intersection of Washington and Cherry, the killer shot Paul Stine once in the back of the head, an execution-style killing. But he didn't flee. He lingered. He was seen by several teenagers across the street, calmly leaning over the front seat, appearing to wipe down the cab. He took Stine's wallet and car keys, and most importantly, he tore a large piece from the back of Paul Stine's blood-soaked shirt. This was his most crucial act. He was collecting a trophy. This wasn't a robbery. It was a harvest. This bloody swatch of fabric would become his new calling card, the irrefutable proof he would mail to the newspapers to validate his claims. He had evolved from a killer into a theatrical terrorist, a collector of proofs, a meticulous signer of his own work, and a direct communicator with the state. The Zodiac, in his final and most terrifying form, was now fully born. The murder of Paul Stine in the heart of San Francisco was a tactical error that almost led to the killer's immediate capture. As the Zodiac walked away from the cab, a patrol car carrying officers Donald Fouque and Eric Zelms passed him. They had received a dispatch, but in a now infamous blunder, the dispatcher had mistakenly broadcast the suspect's race as black, not white. Seeing a white man calmly walking away from the scene, they passed him by. It was the closest law enforcement would ever come to catching the Phantom. Just days later, the Zodiac's next letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, mocking this very failure. It began, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I am the murderer of the taxi driver." Inside was the bloody piece of Paul Stine's shirt. The proof was undeniable. He had embarrassed the entire SFPD, and the city plunged into a state of panic. This letter opened the floodgates. The Zodiac's communication became more frequent, more arrogant, and more terrifying. He was no longer just a killer. He was a domestic terrorist. He mailed a new, complex 340-character cipher, which would remain unsolved for over 50 years. He mailed a diagram for a death machine, a fertilizer bomb he planned to use. And then came his most chilling threat, a letter claiming he would attack a school bus. "I shall," he wrote, "pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out." This single threat mobilized the entire state. Police convoys began escorting school buses, helicopters monitored routes, and parents lived in a state of mortal fear. The Zodiac was no longer just a Bay Area problem. He was a national headline, a bogeyman who had an entire state held hostage. The manhunt was massive, but it was also chaotic, spanning multiple jurisdictions that rarely communicated effectively. At the center of this storm was the iconic composite sketch, a bespectacled, heavy-set man, compiled from the testimony of the teenagers who saw him at the Steiny scene and, possibly Officer Fook. This face was plastered everywhere, yet it led nowhere. However, one name began to surface repeatedly: Arthur Lee Allen. Allen became and remains the most compelling suspect in the case. The circumstantial evidence against him was staggering. He lived in Vallejo, near the epicenter of the first attacks. He had been dishonorably discharged from the Navy. He owned and wore a Zodiac brand watch, complete with the crosshairs symbol. He owned weapons and boots of the same size and brand as those at the Lake Berryessa crime scene. Most damningly, a former friend, Don Cheney, told police that years earlier, Allen had confessed his desire to hunt people using a flashlight attached to a gun, that he would taunt the police with letters, and that he would even call himself Zodiac. When police searched Allen's trailer, they found weapons, ammunition, and evidence of a fascination with small explosives. On paper, he was the perfect fit. But in forensics, he was a ghost. Arthur Lee Allen's fingerprints did not match the bloody print found in Paul Stein's cab. His DNA, later tested against a partial profile developed from the saliva on the letter stamps, was not a match. Multiple handwriting experts concluded that his script did not match the Zodiac's distinctive scrawl. Allen, the man who seemed to be the perfect monster, was, in the eyes of forensics, innocent. As the years dragged on, the investigation stalled. The letters, once a torrent, slowed to a trickle and then stopped altogether. The case went cold. Justice was never served. The Zodiac, the master of his own game, had won. He had taunted the entire state, embarrassed law enforcement at every turn, and created a legend that would outlive him. He achieved his twisted goal of immortality, not by collecting slaves for an afterlife, but by becoming a permanent, unsolved question mark in the American psyche. The files remain open in Napa, Solano, and San Francisco, a testament not to a pursuit of justice, but to a profound and permanent failure to achieve it. In the half-century of obsession that followed, the Zodiac's mythology has almost completely overshadowed the truth. His ciphers, his letters, and his chilling executioner's hood have become icons of true crime pop culture. But this was never a game. It was not a puzzle. The Zodiac didn't deal in symbols. He dealt in human lives, and the cost of his calculated performance is a debt that can never be repaid, a void that has swallowed dozens of lives. We must remember the names that are not Zodiac. We must remember the people he reduced to mere footnotes in his own sick, narcissistic narrative. David Faraday was just 17. He was a bright kid, an Eagle Scout, known for his kind, dependable nature and his love for science. Betty Lou Jensen was 16. She was an honor student, well-liked and full of life. This was their very first formal date. They weren't just the first victims. They were two high school kids on the absolute threshold of their adult lives, their futures extinguished on a dark, cold road for no reason other than one man's need to begin his game. Darlene Ferrin was 22. She wasn't just a name in a police report. She was a wife and a young mother, described by those who knew her as vivacious, outgoing, and the life of the party. Her death left a daughter to grow up without her, a family shattered by a senseless act that served only as the killer's second-act plot point. Cecilia Shepard, 22, was a gifted, intelligent student at the University of the Pacific. She was deeply empathetic, had a future in music, and was known for her kindness. She fought for her life for 2 agonizing days in the hospital before succumbing to 10 stab wounds, a victim of unimaginable terror. Her potential, her intellect, her light, all sacrificed so the killer could carve a symbol on a car door. And Paul Stein was 29. He wasn't just the cab driver. He was a husband. He was a graduate student, working his way through San Francisco State College, studying to become a teacher. His murder wasn't just an execution. It was the theft of a future dedicated to educating others. His bloody shirt, which the killer paraded as a trophy, was a relic stolen from a man who represented everything the Zodiac was not: productive, dedicated, and real. And then there are the living victims. Michael Mageau and Brian Hartnell. They didn't just survive a random attack, they were forced to carry the physical and psychological scars of that night for the rest of their lives. Brian Hartnell, after being stabbed repeatedly, listened to the killer walk away, listened to his friend Cecilia's pained breathing, and somehow found the strength to get help. His life forever marked by those horrific moments. Michael Mageau, shot in the face, neck and chest, had to live with the memory of Darlene's final moments. They became unwilling celebrities, hounded by a media and a public obsessed not with them, but with the man who tried to kill them. This tragic symmetry extends even to those who chased the phantom. Investigators like Dave Toschi, the SFPD inspector, who became the real-life inspiration for Dirty Harry, found his own career and reputation defined and nearly ruined by this single, unsolvable case. The Zodiac's shadow consumed his life, and perhaps most tragically, it consumed the life of Arthur Lee Allen. While he remains a compelling suspect to many, the fact is, he was never charged. He lived his entire adult life as the Zodiac suspect, a pariah in his own community, hounded by police and amateur sleuths, his name forever linked to a monster. Whether he was guilty or innocent, the Zodiac's game destroyed his life all the same. The killer didn't just take 5 lives, he claimed dozens more, creating a devastating ripple effect of trauma, obsession, and ruined legacies that continues to this day. In the decades since the Zodiac's letters stopped, the case has evolved from a manhunt into a national obsession, a dark folklore that has spawned countless books, films, and sleepless nights for amateur sleuths. The central debate has always been, was the Zodiac a criminal mastermind, a diabolical genius who outwitted an entire state? Or was he just a pathetic, insecure, and ultimately lucky failure who stumbled his way into infamy? The media and many armchair detectives have always focused on the who and the how, analyzing the ciphers, the timelines, and the physical evidence in a desperate attempt to put a name to the phantom. But according to criminal psychologists and the FBI's behavioral profilers, this obsession with his identity misses the entire point. The biggest mistake is to categorize the Zodiac as a conventional serial killer. He was not a lust killer like Bundy, driven by twisted sexual impulses. He was not a power killer in the traditional sense like BTK, who needed physical domination over his victims. The Zodiac was something new, something terrifyingly modern. He was a psychological terrorist. His primary motive was not the act of killing. The murders were secondary. They were the means to an end. The true motive, the all-consuming engine that drove his every action, was pathological narcissism. His goal was not murder. His goal was infamy. He didn't just want to kill people. He wanted to be known for killing people. He wanted his chosen name, the Zodiac, to be spoken with the same fear and awe as a mythological god. This theory reframes everything. The murders weren't the main event. They were just the proof of purchase he needed to get his real product, his letters, his ciphers, his persona, published. His true arena was not the dark lovers' lanes of Vallejo. It was the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle. His real weapon wasn't a gun or a knife. It was a ballpoint pen. He saw the investigation not as a threat, but as a game he was directing. Every time the police failed, every time the media printed his symbol, it fed his desperate narcissistic supply. He saw himself as the brilliant, misunderstood anti-hero of his own epic. The slaves for the afterlife fantasy wasn't a genuine belief. It was a PR-friendly, mythological narrative he crafted for himself, a way to elevate his grubby, meaningless violence into something grand and eternal. This theory of pathological narcissism also provides the most logical answer as to why he suddenly stopped. A true diabolical genius wouldn't just quit the game, but a narcissist would. Perhaps the media attention waned, perhaps another story, like the Manson family murders which occurred at the same time, pushed him off the front page, or perhaps in his mind he had simply won. He had proven his superiority. Any further action risked capture, and for a pathological narcissist, to be caught and revealed as an ordinary, pathetic man would be a fate worse than death. It would destroy the entire illusion. The Zodiac's case, therefore, is not just a chilling unsolved mystery. It is a landmark, a turning point in the history of crime. He was arguably the first. He wrote the script that countless others, from the son of Sam to the DC snipers, would later follow. He taught a generation of killers that the media was a tool to be manipulated, a stage for their own horrific performances. He demonstrated that you could terrorize an entire population, not just with violence, but with the threat of violence, with a symbol and a pen name. He forced law enforcement and the press into a terrible partnership, where every publication of his letters, intended to warn the public, also served as a reward for his actions. His legacy is a chilling reminder that we live in a culture that can, at times, value fame over all else. He demonstrated that the line between infamy and celebrity is terrifyingly thin. Ultimately, the Zodiac achieved his goal. He became immortal. He is not a man, but a question mark. He is a dark legend, a ghost in the American psyche. The case files remain open, but it is no longer a search for a person. It is a search for an answer that may never come. And that perhaps was his true final victory, creating a puzzle he knew the world could never ever solve.